Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Northern Michigan Dogman and her son. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Everyone in Northern Michigan knows about the Dogman. Not the kind of creature you'd find in a storybook, mind you, but the real thing. Standing 7 feet tall, with a wolf's head perched on something like a man's body. I never believed the stories myself, not until last October, when I was hiking the remote trails west of Gaylord. I'd spent 20 years doing solo backcountry hikes, documenting wildlife for my nature blog. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and decaying leaves, and the maples blazed red against a steel-gray sky threatening snow. Perfect conditions for spotting wildlife, I thought, though I had no idea what kind of wildlife I was about to encounter. I've been told the stories started back around 1887, when lumberjacks reported seeing a creature that walked upright like a man, but had the head of a massive wolf. The sightings never really stopped, clustering around the decade years. 1987, 1997, 2007. Ask any local about the Dogman and they'll tell you about a cousin or a friend who saw something strange in the woods. But these weren't the thoughts occupying my mind as I made my way along an unmarked trail that morning. I was more concerned with finding a good campsite before dark and maybe photographing some migrating birds. What caught my attention first was the silence. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that silence is never really silent. There's always the rustle of small animals, bird calls, wind in the trees, but this was silent. This was the kind of silence that feels like a held breath, like the forest itself was trying not to make a sound. And that's the moment when I saw them. In a small clearing about 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by a fallen oak, was something my brain initially refused to process. A creature that seemed to be a horrifying combination of a wolf and a human was sitting up on its haunches, cradling what looked like a smaller version of itself in its arms. The adult, the mother I realized with a jolt, was easily 7 feet tall even in its sitting position. Its fur was mottled gray-brown, darker around its distinctly canine head, which housed amber eyes that seemed too intelligent for any natural animal. But it was what the creature was doing that surprised me the most. With movements that were somehow both bestial and tender, she was grooming her young, using massive clawed hands to carefully pick through the pup's fur. The younger one, about the size of a medium-sized dog, had lighter, almost silvery fur and was squirming playfully. I stood frozen, my hand instinctively reaching for my camera before common sense stopped me. The mother's ears were constantly moving, rotating like radar dishes to catch any sound of threat. Every few moments, she would lift her head and scan the forest, her nostrils flaring. I knew that one wrong move, one snap of a twig, would alert her to my presence. The pup rolled onto its back, revealing a belly covered in softer-looking fur, and pawed at its mother's face with hands that seemed caught between paws and human fingers. The mother responded by nuzzling the pup's stomach, causing it to wiggle in apparent delight. The scene was so intimate, so startlingly maternal, that I felt like an intruder in the worst way. I watched them for a few minutes, and then my mind raced with questions. How many of them were there? Were these the only two? How had they remained hidden for so long? Was this why all those hikers had gone missing over the years? But beneath the questions was a growing sense of unease. If the mother caught my scent or spotted me, I had no doubt those maternal instincts would transform instantly into something deadly. A light breeze stirred the leaves around me, and I felt my heart stop as I realized it was blowing from behind me toward them. The mother's head snapped up, her ears pointed forward, and I knew my time was up. With movements that I prayed were slow enough to avoid detection, I began backing away, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to turn and to run. My heart was still pounding as I put distance between myself and those creatures. My slow backing away had eaten up precious daylight, and I needed to find a campsite fast. The deepening shadows seemed to hide watching eyes, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I found a suitable spot near a small stream, sheltered by a cluster of white pines. The location went against every rule of backcountry camping I had learned over the years. It was too close to a game trail, and the dense undergrowth limited visibility. But it was also naturally concealed, and right then, staying hidden felt more important than following standard camping protocols. My hands shook as I set up my tent, fumbling with familiar equipment that suddenly seemed awkward and foreign. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The rational part of my brain tried to calculate the creature's likely territory range, wondering if I had gone far enough away. The irrational part of my mind remembered those intelligent amber eyes, and wondered if normal animal behavior patterns even applied in this case. As I worked, I tried to process what I had seen. The Dogman wasn't supposed to be real. It was supposed to be a campfire story, a local legend, something to attract tourists to small northern towns. But I couldn't deny what I had seen. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something profound, something that was never meant to be discovered. The tender scene between mother and pup kept replaying in my mind, making me feel like a trespasser in a world I wasn't supposed to even know existed. When darkness fell that night, it felt really hard. I had skipped cooking dinner, opting instead for trail mix and beef jerky, anything to avoid food smells that might attract attention. The forest night was alive with its usual sounds, the hollow call of a great horned owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the leaf litter, the soft whisper of wind through the pines. But now every sound carried new meaning and new threats. Around midnight, the normal forest chorus changed. The owl fell silent mid-call. Small rustling sounds ceased abruptly. That same unnatural silence I'd noticed earlier descended, but this time it felt closer, more immediate. I lay in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, straining to hear through the thin nylon walls of my tent. And that's when I heard it. A soft padding sound, like heavy paws trying to move quietly through the forest debris. It was accompanied by smaller, lighter footfalls and occasional tiny whimpers that made my blood run cold. They weren't passing by. They were circling my campsite. The logical part of my brain insisted that if they meant me harm, they probably would have attacked already. The more primitive part of my brain remembered every detail of those massive claws and those powerful jaws. I reached for my flashlight, but I stopped myself. Would light drive them away, or might it provoke them? Would staying still make me seem less threatening, or would it make me seem like easy prey? A sudden snuffling sound came from just outside my tent, followed by what could only be described as a curious chirp. The pup, I realized. It must have followed my scent. A deeper rumbling sound followed, a warning growl from the mother that I felt more than heard, vibrating in my chest cavity. They were so close I could hear their breathing. I could almost feel their presence through the thin barrier of my tent. I lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, as the sounds continued. There was movement in the underbrush beyond my tent, the crack of branches under heavy weight. They were moving away from my campsite, but in which direction? The sounds faded into the distance, but sleep was impossible now. After what felt like hours of lying rigid in my sleeping bag, I made a decision that went against every survival instinct. I, for some reason, just had to know where they went. With trembling fingers, I untied the tent flap and I emerged into that moonlit forest. The nearly full moon cast deep shadows between the trees, but it provided enough light to move by. I followed the direction of the sounds, placing each foot carefully to minimize noise. The air had grown colder, and my breath formed small clouds that dissipated in the silver light. About 100 yards from my campsite, I found their tracks. Massive paw prints alongside smaller ones, pressed deep in the soft earth. The tracks led me to an ancient white pine that had fallen long ago. Time and decay had hollowed out its massive trunk, creating a natural shelter about 8 feet in diameter. As I approached, moving as silently as I could, I heard soft sounds coming from within. Gentle breathing, occasional whimpers, the quiet shifting of large bodies against wood and earth. I crept closer, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, until I could see into the hollow trunk. The sight stopped me cold, but not from fear this time. The mother Dogman lay curled in a tight circle, her massive frame somehow fitted perfectly into the curved space of the hollow. Her fur appeared silver in the moonlight that filtered through gaps in the trunk, and her breathing was deep and regular. The pup was nestled against her belly, completely encircled by its mother's body, one of its 2 human hands clutching a fistful of her fur, even in sleep. The mother's tail had wrapped around the pup like a blanket, and occasionally it would twitch, causing the pup to snuggle closer. Every few moments, one or the other would make small sounds, tiny whimpers or gentle rumbles that spoke of complete contentment. The pup's face in sleep was less frightening than it had been in daylight, looking more like a regular wolf pup's, albeit larger. Its ears would occasionally flutter, perhaps chasing something in its dreams. The scene was so peaceful, so unexpectedly tender, that I found myself sinking to my knees to watch. Here were creatures that supposedly didn't exist, that violated everything we knew about natural history and evolution, sleeping as naturally as any other mother and child in the wild. The moonlight played across their fur, highlighting the rise and fall of their breathing, creating an almost magical tableau that seemed to exist outside of normal reality. I noticed other details too, how the mother's massive body was positioned to block the trunk's opening, protecting her pup from any threat that might approach. How the hollow had been carefully lined with dry leaves, and what looked like shed fur, creating a cozy nest. There were even a few small bones scattered around, evidence of recent meals brought back to their den. As I watched, the pup shifted in its sleep, letting out a tiny whine. The mother's ears twitched at the sound, and she lifted her head slightly, her nose working the air even in sleep. That was my cue to leave. I backed away as carefully as I had approached, storing every detail of the scene in my memory. Whatever these creatures were, however they had come to exist, they were far more than the monsters of campfire stories. They were a family surviving in the last wild places of Michigan, trying to remain hidden from the world of us humans. Dawn found me breaking camp with shaking hands, still processing what I'd witnessed during the night. The morning was crisp and clear, frost coating the fallen leaves in delicate patterns. I kept glancing at that hollow tree, visible through the trees from my campsite, but there was no sign of its occupants anymore. They must have left their shelter before first light. I needed to get back to civilization, to try to make sense of everything I'd seen. My pack felt unusually heavy as I shouldered it, weighted down perhaps by the secret knowledge that I now carried. Should I tell anyone? Would anyone even believe me? The photos I hadn't taken would have been worth a fortune. But somehow I felt grateful now that I hadn't violated that private moment between mother and pup. The forest felt different in the morning light, less threatening, more like the familiar woods I'd hiked through countless times before. Birds had resumed their normal activities, chickadees and nuthatches flitting through the branches above. A red squirrel scolded me from a nearby tree. Everything seemed almost disappointingly normal. But then, I heard it. A high-pitched yapping sound, somewhere between a wolf pup's bark and a dog. I froze mid-step, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the crack of branches as something moved through the underbrush. Before I could decide whether to run or stay still, the Dogman pup burst into view. In the morning light, it looked almost playful. Its silver-gray fur was tousled, leaves and twigs stuck in it from its run through the forest. Its tongue lolled out in what seemed like a grin, and its tail wagged with unmistakable excitement. Despite everything I knew about wild animals, despite the terror of the night before, I found myself smiling right back at him. "Well, hello there," I said softly, dropping into a crouch. The pup's ears perked forward at my voice, and it took a tentative step closer. Couldn't have been more than 30 feet away now, and I could see the curiosity in its amber eyes. Those eyes still held that unsettling intelligence, but in that pup's face it seemed more charming than threatening. Looking back, I can't believe what I did next. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or perhaps the magical quality of the previous night's scene had affected my judgment, but as the pup took another cautious step forward, I held out my hand and said, "Wanna come say hi?" "It's okay, little one." The pup's tail wagged hard, and it bounced slightly on its paws, clearly torn between excitement and uncertainty. Then it took another step forward, and another, its nose working the air as it caught my scent. That's when I heard it. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The pup's ears flattened against its head, and it backed away quickly. Through the trees behind it, I caught glimpses of movement. Gray-brown fur, massive shoulders, teeth bared in a snarl that turned my blood to ice. The mother had arrived, and she was not happy. The transformation in the mother Dogman was terrifying to witness. Gone was any trace of the gentle creature I had watched caring for her pup. Her fur stood on end, making her massive frame appear even larger. Her lips pulled back to reveal teeth longer than my fingers, and a growl like rolling thunder emanated from deep in her chest. The pup whimpered and scampered behind her, all playfulness forgotten. I had precisely 1 second to make a decision, and my body made it for me. I ran. The sound that erupted behind me was unlike anything I had ever heard. Part wolf's howl, part woman's scream, but all rage. The crash of breaking branches and thud of heavy paws told me she was in pursuit, and she was fast. Very fast. My pack bounced against my back as I sprinted through the forest, my boots slipping on frost-covered leaves. I darted between trees, hoping their close-set trunks would slow down my pursuer. They didn't. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths that seemed to buzz in my skull. A low-hanging branch caught my shoulder, spinning me sideways. I recovered, but the momentary slowdown cost me precious distance. I could feel her presence now. I could smell her wild, musky scent. The rational part of my brain kept screaming that this was impossible. Nothing that large should be able to move so quickly through dense forest. I broke through a patch of sumac, thorns tearing at my clothes, and I found myself facing a steep ravine. Without slowing, I half ran and half slid down the incline, using saplings to control my descent. Behind me I heard the mother's claws scrabbling on the loose soil. The pup's anxious barks echoed from somewhere above. At the bottom of the ravine I splashed through a shallow creek and up the other side, my lungs burning. The cold morning air felt like knives in my chest. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The mother Dogman was halfway down the ravine, her powerful limbs eating up the distance, those intelligent eyes now burning with primal fury. When our gazes met, she let out another bone-chilling howl. I crested the ravine's far side and spotted Salvation, a stand of massive maples growing so close together that their trunks formed a natural barrier. Beyond them I could see brighter light that suggested a clearing, maybe even a road. I dove between the trees, squeezing through gaps I hoped would be too small for my pursuer. The enraged roar behind me suggested that I had guessed right. I heard the sound of claws scraping bark, of powerful muscles straining against unyielding wood. But I didn't stop to look. I ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until my legs trembled and my vision blurred, until I finally broke through the tree line onto an old logging road. Only then did I allow myself to collapse, gulping air into my burning lungs. When I could finally raise my head, the forest behind me was silent. Through the trees I caught a final glimpse of movement. The mother's massive form, still visible due to her height, shepherding her pup away from the road, away from human contact, back into the deep woods, where their kind had managed to stay hidden for so long. S.A. Rose, the Rose That Knows. Please join me in thanking channel member S.A. Rose for making this episode possible. As a $7 channel member, S.A. Rose gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes. The Beasts of Lehigh Gorge. I once saw a dogman, or maybe I saw two of them. It was at Lehigh Gorge, which is about 100 miles as the crow flies west of New York City. You can usually drive there in 2.5 hours. This is not western PA. This is almost not even central. It's fairly east for a story about seeing weirdo cryptids, I guess, and for that I apologize. I have been told multiple times that such things can happen a 2-hour drive from the Empire State Building, and I honestly wish I could tell you that it happened in a more obscure location. But this is a story that happened on the hill overlooking the Lehigh Gorge in Jim Thorpe. That's just where I was when I saw all the crazy stuff I'm about to tell you about. I had been camping in the hills above Lehigh Gorge for 3 nights when I started to feel it. The sensation that I was not entirely alone. It wasn't the usual wilderness solitude, the kind that settles on you like a second skin after a few days in the backcountry. This was something else, something just outside my understanding, pressing in from the edges of my awareness. The hills there were rugged, the rock formations ancient and layered with time. Some of the cliffs had small caves in their faces, little pockets of shelter that offered just enough space to stay dry if the weather turned. I had found one of these caves tucked high above the gorge, its entrance half hidden behind a twist of mountain laurel. It was perfect for me. Remote, quiet, and untouched. I could sit at the edge of the cliff and look out over the treetops, watching the river wind through the valley below like a silver thread. At night the forest was a living thing. Wind moved through the trees in long whispering breaths, and distant animal calls echoed in the dark. I had expected that. I even welcomed it. But there was another layer of sound, too. Something deep, low, just barely registering in my consciousness. A movement too heavy for a deer, but too delicate for a bear. Twice in the early hours before dawn, I had heard something behind the tree line. A thud of weight against the earth. A rustle that didn't quite fit the usual rhythm of the forest. I would sit up, listening, but it always faded before I could be sure. I told myself it was my imagination. I had done enough solo trips to know how easy it was to let the mind turn shadows into shapes, silence into whispers. Out here alone, there was no one to second-guess me. But that didn't explain why the woods had felt so still the evening before it happened. I had been watching the sunset, the sky a tangle of fire-colored clouds stretched above the ridgeline, when I noticed something odd. The birds had gone silent. No evening calls, no distant flutter of wings. Even the usual rustling of small creatures moving through the undergrowth had stopped. The woods had, emptied. It set my nerves on edge in a way that was hard to explain. I checked my gear, making sure my pack was secured, my knife within reach. I sat at the cave entrance for a while, looking out over the cliffside, waiting for the sounds to return. But they didn't, not that night. When I finally drifted off, it was uneasy sleep, filled with half-formed dreams of movement beyond the trees. Something watching, something waiting. I woke before dawn, drawn from sleep by a feeling I couldn't name. The air was cold, the sky still held the last hints of night, and that's when I saw them. 2 figures moving fast, locked in brutal struggle, and they were not human. I don't remember standing up, but when I blinked fully awake, I was already on my feet, pressed into the shadow of the cave's entrance. My breath was slow, controlled, but my pulse hammered in my ears as I took in the sight before me. 2 figures moved against the dim pre-dawn sky on the opposite cliff, maybe 50 yards away. At first I thought they were bears fighting. Large, fast, powerful. But as my vision adjusted, I realized these weren't bears I was looking at. One of them was enormous, at least 15, 20 feet tall, with thick dark fur and a hulking muscular frame. Even hunched over, it loomed over the second figure, which was a man-sized creature that also stood on two legs but moved with a wiry agility, dodging and weaving in and out of reach. They fought like wild animals, snarling and snapping at each other with a ferocity that made my stomach turn. The bigger one, the monstrous one, swiped at the smaller one with massive clawed hands, missing by inches as the second creature twisted away. It was hard to make out the details in the weak light, but I could see the smaller one was lean, built for speed, its movements almost too fluid, too precise, like a predator that knew exactly how close it could get without getting caught. Then for the first time, I saw its face. The smaller one wasn't fully covered in fur like the giant. It had patches of exposed skin, sinewy and taut over powerful muscles. Its head was elongated, somewhere between a wolf and a man. But its eyes were intelligent, calculating. This one wasn't just fighting to survive. This one was testing the bigger one. The massive beast lunged, jaws snapping inches from the smaller creature's throat. The smaller one twisted, slamming a powerful kick into its attacker's ribs, sending it stumbling back a step. But the moment of victory was short-lived. With an almost unnatural speed, the larger creature pivoted, throwing its weight forward. Its massive hand caught the smaller one by the shoulder and hurled it through the air. I flinched as the smaller creature hit the ground hard, rolling several feet before coming to a crouched stop near the edge of the cliff. It shook itself, rising, slowly, a low snarl rolling from its throat. The giant let out a sound that sent ice through my veins, a deep guttural growl that reverberated in my chest. Then, with terrifying speed, it dropped to all fours and charged. The smaller creature didn't wait this time. It turned and ran, leaping onto an outcropping of rock and scrambling up to a higher level of the cliffside. The giant followed, bounding after it with powerful strides. I lost sight of them as they disappeared over the ridge, their snarls and the sound of their fighting fading into the trees beyond. I stayed frozen in place, breath shallow, heart hammering. My brain struggled to process what I had just seen. Were those werewolves? That was impossible. But what else could they be? Whatever those things were, they weren't just animals. They fought with purpose. The smaller one wasn't just defending itself, it was thinking. And the larger one, that was something beyond natural. That was something just wrong. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty cliffside, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke over the ridge, the forest seemed to breathe again. Birds began calling. The usual rustling of wildlife returned. The world reset, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I wasn't the only one watching. Everything returned to normal. Everything sounded exactly as it should, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I sat down at the edge of my cave, staring at the ridge where the two creatures had disappeared. My mind was trying to force logic onto what I had seen, but there was no way to make it fit. I had watched something impossible happening in front of me. Two creatures, one enormous, the other eerily human-like, had fought like animals, but with a purpose that suggested something more than instinct. I ran through every explanation I could think of. A bear fight. No, bears don't move like that. And that thing, the bigger one, was beyond anything in the animal kingdom. It was something else entirely. Could it have been some kind of elaborate hoax? Highly unlikely. Who would be out here deep in the wilderness before dawn staging a fight like that? And how could anyone fake creatures that moved with that kind of raw power? Could I have imagined it? I had to admit this was the simplest explanation, but It didn't sit quite right with me. I had felt the ground shudder when the larger one landed after its leap. I had heard the snarls, the sound of claws scraping rock, the force of bodies colliding. My senses had been overwhelmed with it. It had to have been real. I rubbed my face, my skin cold despite the rising sun. What disturbed me the most wasn't just the creatures themselves. It was the way the fight had played out. The smaller one hadn't just been running for its life. It had been testing, or maybe teaching the larger one, striking fast, avoiding capture. And the bigger one, it hadn't fought like a wild animal. It had fought like something that knew it wasn't just hunting. It was dominating. Then there was the size difference. I had read about supposed sightings of dogmen or werewolves before, usually dismissed as urban legends or misidentifications of large wolves or bears. But this was something else. The massive one was just too big, too unnatural, almost exaggerated in its proportions. How had it become that way? Was it simply older, stronger, or was there something else at play here? And what about the smaller one? Was it another creature like the large one, just not fully transformed? Or had I witnessed something even stranger? A human in the midst of turning? The questions clawed at my mind, but I had no answers. All I knew was that I had seen something that defied explanation. And somehow I knew I wasn't done seeing it yet. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again. Those creatures locked in combat, the sheer power behind every movement, the way the smaller one had thought through its strikes, as if it knew exactly how far it could push before retreating. I wasn't just disturbed by what I had witnessed. I was curious, too. Curiosity can be dangerous, especially out there alone in the hills. By the time the first hints of morning had touched the sky, I was already awake, sitting near the mouth of my cave, with a thermos of lukewarm coffee in my hands. I told myself I wasn't expecting to see anything again. That last morning had been a fluke, a glimpse of something I was never meant to witness. But when I saw movement on the ridge right across from me, I knew I'd been wrong. At first I thought it was the smaller creature from before. It stood upright, its posture relaxed but alert, staring toward the edge of the cliff. The dim light made it impossible to make out any real details, but it didn't seem as beastly as the night before. Its shape was more human this time, broad-shouldered and tall, but not monstrous. And then I saw the other one. The massive figure moved into view, silent, almost predatory. Its fur was dark, blending into the lingering shadows of the trees, but there was no mistaking it. The same enormous, hulking creature from before, the one that had dominated the fight. It moved on all fours at first, then slowly rose onto its hind legs, towering over the man-sized figure beside it. They weren't fighting this time. They were communicating. This realization hit me like a punch to the chest. I couldn't hear anything from this distance, but the way they stood, the way the massive one's head tilted slightly as the smaller creature moved its arms, gesturing. It was unmistakable. This wasn't some wild animal stalking prey. This was some kind of a meeting. Maybe a classroom. I strained my eyes trying to make out more details. The smaller figure turned slightly, and for a moment, I was convinced I was looking at a man. He wasn't covered in thick fur like the massive one, and his stance wasn't hunched or aggressive. He seemed calm, in control, and if he was human, what was he doing there? The huge creature shifted, exhaling hard through its snout. Its yellow eyes flickered in the low light, trained on the smaller figure like it was listening to every word. And then, just as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, this meeting ended. The smaller figure turned and strode toward the tree line, disappearing into the forest like he belonged there. The massive beast hesitated, lifting its head as if testing the air, then dropped back onto all fours and followed. Within moments, they were both gone. I sat there, stunned, my coffee forgotten in my hands. This changed everything. I had spent the last day questioning whether what I had seen was real, but this was different. There was no fight, no violence. There was a clear structure to what had happened. One speaking, the other listening. The idea of these creatures being nothing more than animals was shattered. And that smaller one, if he wasn't fully one of them, was he something else entirely? A shapeshifter, a human on the edge of transformation? Or was I completely wrong about what I had seen? Either way, I wasn't imagining it. Something real was happening in those woods. And whatever it was bigger than me. I stayed at that cave for one more day, not because I expected to see them again, but because I needed time to process what I had witnessed. 2 dawns, 2 events that defied everything I thought I knew about the world. The first had been a battle, vicious, primal, but with an underlying strategy. The second had been something else entirely, a meeting or a conversation, and that was what unsettled me the most. I kept running through every possible explanation. Were they both the same kind of creature? It would be easy to assume that both figures, both from the fight and from the meeting, were the same type of being. But if that were true, why the size difference? The larger one was something else entirely, something exaggerated, beyond what should be possible. Had the smaller one been the younger version of the same species? Maybe it hadn't fully changed yet. That would make sense, except that during the battle it had seemed just as intelligent, if not more, than the larger one. It fought with purpose, with quick, deliberate movements, while the giant one relied on sheer, overwhelming power. Maybe they weren't the same kind of creature at all. Was the smaller one a human? This was the idea that wouldn't leave me alone. That second morning when I saw him standing on the ridge, the way he moved, the way he gestured, it felt like I was looking at a human. But if that's what he was, then that meant something even more impossible. Either he had control over what he was, able to shift in and out of that monstrous form at will, or he was some other kind of thing entirely. Maybe he wasn't a creature at all, but a person who had some sort of connection to this beast. Was it his to command? Had I witnessed not just a battle, but some kind of a challenge? Had the smaller one been testing the massive beast before taking its place as its handler, its master? Or had it been a warning? How had the large one become so massive? If those things were real, and at this point I couldn't convince myself otherwise, then why was the big one so much larger than the small one? Was it just older? Had it been changed by something, some kind of transformation beyond the usual? Or was it made that way? Part of me wondered if the massive one had been forced into something unnatural, something beyond its control. If it had started as something more like the smaller one but had been altered, twisting into a version of itself that was stronger and larger, but maybe less intelligent, less controlled. And if that were true, then the smaller one might have been there to contain it. Or worse, maybe it was trying to fix it. Was this normal? Was this a pattern? The most terrifying thought of all was that maybe this wasn't a rare occurrence. Maybe things like this happened out here all the time, far from human eyes. Maybe there were rules, a structure, a system in place that I had glimpsed, but could never understand. What if there were other creatures like the smaller one? People who knew what was out here and kept it in check? Or were there more creatures like the massive one, lurking just beyond where we dared to go? I had come out there looking for solitude, for a connection with nature. But what if nature had far more secrets than I could ever have imagined? I left the cave that afternoon, making my way back down the trails towards civilization. I told myself I'd let it go, that I'd write it off as a strange experience and move on with my life. But here we are years later, and I still find myself staring out into the woods at night and wondering, what did I really see? Had I witnessed something ancient, something primal, something that had been happening long before I arrived, and will continue long after I'm gone? Or had I simply been in the wrong place at the right time, long enough to catch a glimpse of something that wasn't meant for human eyes.
She donated to us, and her name is Crystal. She's magnanimous and sharp as a pistol. Please join me in thanking channel member Crystal Karoshka for making this episode possible. As a $7 channel member, Crystal gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes.
Mugged by the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I hear stories on your channel about how nice Dogman is and how intelligent and so forth. I wouldn't know about any of that. I had one encounter with one of these kinds of creatures and it was anything but a happy experience. In fact, the way I would describe it, I would say I was mugged by the Dogman. I've always been a creature of habit. Every evening around the same time I used to lace up my hiking boots, throw on a jacket, and take to the familiar trail behind my house. It's a well-worn path winding through the Pennsylvania woods, a stretch of old growth that I've been walking through since I was a kid. I grew up on the other side of these here trees, and I've lived on this side since I first bought this place 3 days shy of my 30th birthday. I don't want to say exactly where I am, since I have no plans of moving, and I would rather preserve my privacy. In summer in this forest, the air is thick with the hum of cicadas, and in winter, my breath curls in front of me like smoke. I apologize for waxing poetic, but I love that forest path more than I've ever loved any person. At least, I used to, before the Dogman came along to take me out of my reverie. This happened in November last year, either late autumn or early winter. The sun had started setting earlier, its last amber rays filtering through the canopy as I set off. I knew and still know that path by heart, the curve around the rocky outcrop, the way the creek murmurs just out of sight, the occasional deer that watches from a distance before slipping into the trees. In my Sunday school when I was growing up, they used to have this book that had paintings of heaven. You know, children's book type paintings, not Leonardo da Vinci. And in all these illustrations, heaven looked just like that forest behind where I live. To me, it always was heaven on earth. There was always comfort in my routine, and knowing exactly where each step would take me next. I was walking at an easy pace, listening to the rhythm of my own footsteps crunching over fallen leaves. The day's worries would always slip away, lost in the quiet, immense presence and awe of those woods. But as I rounded a bend near the deeper stretch of the trail, something felt different. It's the silence that got me first. Usually the forest is alive with sound, even at dusk. The rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a branch as some unseen creature moves through the trees. But just then, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the steady thud of my boots against the dirt path. I slowed my steps and I was suddenly aware of how alone I was. Then, from the corner of my eye, I catch movement, a shadow slipping beneath the trees. Too large to be a deer, too fluid to be a bear. I stop. I hold my breath. I stare into the fading light, but I don't see anything else. I shake my head and I exhale, feeling a little foolish. The mind can play tricks out here, especially when the light starts to go. I tell myself that's all it was, just a trick of light and shadow. The wind shifting the branches in just the right way. But as I start walking again, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And then I see it. A shape. Large. Dark. Moving parallel to the path. Keeping pace with me. Yup, there it was again. A shape just beyond the trees. I had noticed it maybe 5 minutes ago, a dark blur shifting between the trunks, pacing me as I walked the familiar dirt trail behind my house. At first I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the late afternoon sun, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But when I slowed my steps, that shadow slowed down too. And when I stopped, silence. The woods behind my house had always been a place of peace, my daily retreat. I knew this trail better than I knew some of my own family. Every turn, every exposed root, every place where the earth sloped downward before rising again. I could have almost walked it blindfolded, but now for the first time, I felt like I was somewhere unfamiliar. I took a breath and I resumed walking, faster this time. Not a run, not yet, but a steady, purposeful stride. Leaves crunched beneath my boots. I kept my eyes ahead, pretending not to notice the shifting darkness in my periphery. But I heard it. Faint, deliberate footfalls that were not mine, pacing me. I told myself again that it was nothing. Some stray dog, maybe a bear. Even if it was a bear, I had encountered them before, and they had always ambled off uninterested in me. But something about this, on this evening, just didn't feel right. I stopped again, and it stopped with me. A thick silence swallowed the woods. No birds, no wind rustling the branches, just me and whatever that was. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just tangled undergrowth, shafts of golden light filtering through bare branches, the skeletal remains of last fall's leaves carpeting the ground. But the feeling didn't go away. A cold prickle crept up my spine. I exhaled through my nose, willing my heartbeat to slow down. It's fine. You're alone. You've walked this path 1,000 times. Then, very deliberately, I took one step forward, and in the trees beside me, something else did too. I bolted. It wasn't a decision, I just ran. My boots pounded the dirt, breath hitching in my throat as I sprinted down the narrow trail. The sound of something crashing through the brush behind me confirmed what I already knew. It was following me. Twigs snapped, branches cracked, something heavy tearing through the undergrowth at an impossible speed. Whatever it was big. Bigger than me. Bigger than any animal I had ever encountered in these woods. I forced myself to go faster. My lungs burned. My legs ached. The winding path that had always felt so familiar now felt like a trap, a twisting tunnel carved through endless trees with no way out. I chanced to look over my shoulder. That wasn't a good idea. A shadow lunged between the trunks, a flash of movement too fast to process, and then it was in front of me. I barely managed to stop in time, skidding on loose dirt, nearly falling backward. My chest heaved, my breath raw. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in my place, trapped in the gaze of the thing that had been following me. It stood in the middle of the path, blocking my way forward. 7 feet tall at least, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, black, streaked with hints of deep brown. Muscles shifted beneath it, broad shoulders rising and falling with each slow breath. Its arms were long, too long, tipped with hands that weren't hands at all, but something worse. Thick, clawed, designed to grasp. But its face, that wasn't human. Not fully. It was canine, but wrong. A long, heavy muzzle, lips pulled back just enough to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth. A nose that twitched like it was tasting my scent in the air. And its ears, pointed, upright, shifting slightly as though it were listening to me. And then there were the eyes. They glowed, not like a reflection, not like catching an animal's gaze at night. These burned from within, deep amber, the color of fire, locked onto me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I took a step back. It took a step forward. I turned and ran. Instantly, a snarl, deep, guttural, vibrating through the air. The sound sent a spike of panic straight through my chest. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted, arms pumping, breath coming in quick, desperate gasps. I heard it behind me, moving fast. Too fast. I veered left, off the path, dodging between trees, leaping over fallen logs, hoping to shake it. For a few agonizing moments, I thought it had worked. Then a low, growling breath, right behind me. I turned my head and it was there, running beside me, not chasing anymore, toying with me. I wasn't going to outrun this thing, and it knew it. I stopped running, not because I wanted to, not because I had a plan, but because there was no point. This thing wasn't chasing me. It was hunting me, and now it had me. My legs locked beneath me, my chest heaving, every nerve in my body screaming to run even as my brain finally caught up to the truth. I couldn't escape. The Dogman stood just a few feet away, its massive form partially hidden by the fading light of the forest. It had cut me off effortlessly, slipping through the trees without sound, as if the woods belonged to it. Well, maybe they did. For a moment, neither of us moved. It watched me. I could feel its eyes on me, those glowing amber eyes burning in the dimming light. Not reflecting light, not catching the sun like an animal's eyes in the dark, but lit from within. Like a fire. Like something alive, something thinking. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to steady. I needed to think. The creature took a slow step forward. My body flinched before I could stop it, and I knew immediately that was a mistake. The thing's ears flicked forward, its lips curling back, revealing more of those long fangs. The corners of its mouth twitched, almost as if it were grinning. I took a step back, and once again, it stepped forward. It was playing with me. I felt my stomach tighten, my fingers twitching at my sides. I was nothing to this thing, just a deer caught in the open, a rabbit frozen in place. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Deer run, rabbits bolt, and this thing liked the chase. I forced myself to stay still, not to run, not to break into another desperate sprint that would only end with me on the ground, and those massive hands grabbing me. The Dogman tilted its head, eyes narrowing just slightly. It was testing me, seeing what I would do. Slowly, carefully, I shifted my weight to one side like I was considering going around it. The second I did, it moved, quick as lightning, cutting me off again. A deep, rumbling growl rolled through its chest, vibrating through the air. And through me, too. I barely stopped myself from stumbling backward. My pulse pounded in my ears, sweat prickling the back of my neck. I opened my mouth, half thinking I could speak. Say something, but what? What do you say to something that isn't even supposed to exist? The Dogman inhaled sharply, flaring its nostrils like it was smelling my fear. And then it moved. Lunging. I threw myself sideways, barely dodging as one of its massive hands swiped at where I'd just been standing. I hit the ground hard, rolling, scrambling back to my feet. And the game began. Again. I ran. Again. The Dogman let me. That was the worst part. It didn't rush me. It didn't immediately give chase. It just stood there for a second or two, watching as I stumbled back into the trees, its glowing amber eyes burning through the dark. Then, just when I thought I might have bought myself a few seconds, it moved. The sound of it tearing through the underbrush was deafening. It was too fast. Every time I zigzagged through the trees, it was there, shifting effortlessly through the gaps, barely making a sound except for the occasional snap of a branch beneath its weight. I wasn't escaping. I was being herded. A flicker of movement to my left, I veered right. The snap of branches behind me, I surged forward. But every time I tried to gain distance, I could feel it, just behind me, just beside me. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't even chasing. It was playing. I wasn't going to last much longer. My lungs burned, every muscle in my legs threatening to seize with exhaustion. I had never been an athlete, just a guy who liked his daily walk in the woods. Now, I was a mouse trying to outrun a cat that had already decided how this was going to end. I risked another look over my shoulder. The Dogman was there, beside me, keeping pace, watching. It turned its head, those glowing amber eyes locking onto mine, and for a brief second, I saw something in its expression. Something calm, like it knew I was done. Panic surged through me. I twisted, pushing myself toward a thicket of fallen trees and tangled brush. If I could just put something solid between us, something it couldn't move through as easily, maybe I could make it back toward the trail, toward home. I leaped over the first log, ducking under a low-hanging branch, scraped my arm against something sharp but barely felt it. Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't look back. A heavy thump to my right. It had jumped the entire thicket. I barely caught myself before I collided with the trunk of a massive oak. Spinning on my heel, I lunged in the opposite direction, but there it was, blocking my path. I slid to a stop, my boots kicking up dead leaves. My breath came in gasping pulls. My legs shook beneath me, but I forced myself to stay upright. The dogman tilted its head again, ears flicking forward. The way it moved, it was too intelligent. It wasn't just a wild animal reacting on instinct. It was choosing, deciding. I took a step back. It took another step forward. Another step back and another step forward. I was gonna collapse. My body couldn't take much more. Every muscle screamed for rest. My chest tight and burning. I knew that if I went down, I wouldn't be getting back up. Not in time. I turned sharp, faking right, then diving left. For the first time, the dogman hesitated. That was all I needed. I bolted, pushing every last ounce of energy into my legs. I could see the trail now just beyond the next line of trees. If I could just... A snarl, a rush of movement, and then... Claws closed around my arm. Those claws dug in. Not deep enough to break skin, but enough to hold, to clamp down with an iron grip that sent a shock of panic through my entire body. I twisted, yanked, with everything I had, but it was useless. A second hand caught me around the ribs, lifting me clean off the ground. I barely had time to react before the world lurched. Suddenly, I wasn't running. I was being carried. I thrashed, I kicked, I twisted, anything to break free, for the creature's hold was unshakable. Its arms, covered in thick fur, felt like they were made of solid steel. Every movement I made only caused my body to jolt against the unyielding grip. I tried to breathe, but my chest was being crushed against its massive forearm, making it impossible to draw in more than short, desperate gasps. While it held me, it started to run. The sensation was like nothing I had ever experienced. The forest blurred, trees whipping past in streaks of green and brown. My stomach flipped violently as the dogman leaped over fallen logs and tore through the undergrowth at impossible speeds. The rhythm of its stride was inhuman. Long, powerful bounds that sent my body jerking with each impact. My head snapped back from the force. The wind roared through my ears. My stomach twisted and turned, struggling to keep up with the shifting momentum. It was like being trapped on a roller coaster with a harness way too tight. Pure speed and the disorienting gut-churning knowledge that I was being taken somewhere. I had no idea where, no idea why, and that was probably the worst part. I wasn't dead. If it had wanted to kill me, it could have done so a dozen times already, but instead it had grabbed me, held me firm, like prey, but not quite. I couldn't think straight. The only thing I knew was that I had to get away. I flailed again, pushing against its grip, but it didn't even acknowledge my struggle. Like I was nothing. Like I weighed nothing. Then, without warning, it stopped. The sudden lack of motion sent my stomach lurching. The dogman exhaled sharply, and then it dropped me. I hit the ground hard, my knees buckling as I crumpled into the dirt, gasping, dazed. By the time I looked up, the creature was already gone. For a little while I just lay there gasping, dizzy, disoriented. Why had it let me go? I forced myself to look up, my head still spinning from the breakneck speed at which it had been carrying me, but nothing. That dogman was gone. I didn't hear footfalls retreating. I didn't hear the sound of brush shifting or leaves crunching. I just heard silence. I swallowed hard, every nerve in my body screaming that I needed to move. but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. I was still too stunned, too shaken, my brain struggling to process what had just happened. I wasn't dead or bleeding, but I also wasn't the same. A flicker of movement caught my eye. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, expecting to see those glowing amber eyes watching me from the tree line. Instead, two joggers, a man and a woman, dressed in running gear, casually making their way down the trail a few yards away. I opened my mouth to call out to say something, but they didn't even glance at me. They just kept running. I sat there stunned, my heart beat a deafening roar in my ears. Had the Dogman dropped me because of them? Because we weren't alone anymore? I turned back toward the woods, scanning the trees, expecting, dreading to see those burning eyes staring back, but there was nothing. Just me and the empty forest. A week later, I bought the treadmill. Top of the line. Expensive. One of those models that could adjust incline automatically, mimicking real terrain. I spent hours programming it to match the exact hills and dips of the trail behind my house. I tell myself it's just the same, that I can get the same exercise, the same feeling. But of course it isn't. The hum of the machine isn't the same as the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The artificial inclines don't feel like the rolling earth beneath me. The air in my house is still and sterile, nothing like the scent of damp earth and pine that used to fill my lungs. But at least here inside, I feel safe. No glowing amber eyes watching me from the trees. No footsteps pacing mine. No massive fur-covered hands waiting to grab me. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I pretend I'm really there, walking the trail like I used to. I imagine the trees stretching overhead, the wind moving through the branches. But I always stop before I reach the bend, because I know what waits beyond it. I used to love walking in those woods. Now, I only walk them in my mind. It's safer that way.
If I wear a spinny hat, will I look all hunky? Will I look like that handsome chap from that TV show, The Monkees? Everybody wants a woolen cat. The scary stories, beanie hat. Everybody knows it's a natural fact. The scary stories, beanie hat. Link is in this video's description if all goes according to plan. Available in black, which is like every color all at once, man.
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.